My name is Valen Kaur, and I am writing this from a prison of my own making. The lights in my chamber flicker because the human engineers who built our power grid stopped answering our calls 6 hours ago. I can hear shouting in the hallway. Outside, the Krell delegate is screaming at someone. The Sithari ambassador has locked herself in her office and refuses to come out, and I, the proud Voxian chief liaison, am sitting at my desk, staring at a single message on my screen. That has changed everything. The message is short, 23 words. I have read it 40 times in the last hour, and each time I feel my heart speed faster. It says that Earth has withdrawn from all diplomatic relations with the Galactic Council effective immediately. All human ambassadors are being recalled. All embassies are closing. We are not to contact them ever. I should explain how we arrived at this moment, because if you are reading this, you need to understand, you need to know what we did, what I did. 3 days ago, I sat in the main council chamber and watched a vote that I now realize was the beginning of our destruction. The Krell delegation, with quiet support from my own Voxian government, pushed through a trade rule that would crush human expansion into the outer veil systems. The new tariffs were brutal. They would bankrupt thousands of human colonies within a single year. The Krell ambassador stood at the speaking platform and laughed as the vote passed. He actually laughed. The human ambassador, a tall woman named Helen Carter, sat very still through the whole process. She did not argue. She did not protest. When the vote ended, she stood up, gathered her papers, and walked out of the chamber. Her footsteps echoed in the silent room. I remember turning to my aide and smiling. I told him that humans were finally learning their place. I told him they had spent 40 years pretending to be our equals, and now they understood. I was wrong about everything. The next day, the Krell ambassador went on council broadcast and called humans an emotional and primitive species. He said their governments were ruled by feelings instead of logic. He said they did not deserve their seats at the diplomatic tables. The Sithari delegation followed by refusing to share medical research with Earth, even though a serious illness was spreading through 3 human colonies. My own premier sent me orders to redirect human refugee ships away from neutral ports to make their lives harder, to remind them who held the power. This galaxy. I followed those orders without question. I signed papers that closed safe harbors to families fleeing disasters. I approved policies designed to make humans suffer just enough to bring them back to the negotiating table on their knees. And the humans said nothing. That silence should have warned me, but I was too proud to see it. I drank fermented nectar in my chambers and toasted what I believed was a great victory for the older species. I told my friends that humans would be back within a month, begging for forgiveness. I was so certain. I had spent my entire career studying them, and I knew their weaknesses. I knew their emotions. I knew they could not survive without us. Then this morning, the message arrived. I read it the first time and laughed. I read it the second time and frowned. By the third reading, my hands were shaking. I called the human embassy and the line was disconnected. I called the human consulate on Sindara's Prime and the building was empty. I sent emergency messages to every human contact I had built over 20 years of diplomatic work. None of them answered, not one. I went to the embassy myself. I needed to see it with my own eyes. The building stood quiet in the morning light. The human flag was gone from the front entrance. The doors were locked. Through the windows I could see empty desks, removed pictures and clean floors. They had not just left. They had erased themselves from the building as if they had never been there at all. A small note was attached to the front door. It contained only one sentence. It said that the building had been sold to a Tellurian property company. That morning, the sale had been completed in 15 minutes. The humans had been preparing for this for a long time. I returned to my chambers and tried to convince myself this was temporary, a diplomatic tantrum, an emotional reaction to the trade vote. Humans were emotional creatures after all. They would calm down, they would come back. But then the reports started coming in. Every human freighter in council space had changed course at exactly the same moment, not gradually, all at once. They were heading home. The shipping company on Vexus Station, which was owned by humans, had closed its doors. The medical clinic on Sindaras that treated the children of 40 species had posted a notice on its door saying it was permanently closed. Human doctors, human engineers, human teachers, human technicians, all of them were quietly packing up their lives and leaving. I called the council speaker and demanded an emergency session. He told me the same thing was happening on his world. He told me his daughter, who was studying at a human university on Earth, had been politely escorted to a transport ship that morning. She was on her way home. Every human-run school across the galaxy had done the same thing. Thousands of students from hundreds of species were being sent back to their home worlds. The speaker's voice broke as he told me this. He said his daughter had loved that school. He said she was crying when she called him. I sat at my desk and tried to understand what was happening. This was not a tantrum. This was not an emotional outburst. This was organized. This was planned. This had been prepared for months, maybe years. A knock came at my door. My aide entered, his skin pale with worry. He handed me a tablet. The Krell military, he said, had just lost contact with 18 of their warships. The ships had not been attacked. They had simply stopped working. Their reactors had powered down on their own. The crews were safe but stranded in deep space, drifting between stars, waiting for rescue. The Krell military used human-built navigation computers in those ships. They had bought them cheaply 20 years ago because human technology was always reliable and inexpensive. They had never bothered to learn how the systems worked. Why would they? The systems just worked. They always worked. Until this morning. I asked my aide if there was any pattern to the failures. He nodded slowly. Every Krell warship that had stopped working contained human-designed components. Every Sathari research station that had gone dark relied on human-trained specialists. Every Voxian factory that had halted production used human-manufactured parts. The humans were not threatening us. They were not attacking us. They were simply leaving, and as they left they were taking with them everything we had grown dependent on without noticing. I pulled up the trade reports for the last 50 years. My hands shook as I scrolled through them. 47% of our advanced medicines came from human laboratories. 63% of our agricultural yields depended on human-engineered seed. 71% of our rare earth refining was done by human-owned companies, our communication networks, our power grids, our food production systems, our medical infrastructure, all of it had human fingerprints on it. We had not noticed because humans never demanded credit. They smiled, they worked hard, they charged fair prices. They never threatened us, they never reminded us how much we needed them. And now they were gone. I called my premier on the secure line. He answered on the first ring, which told me he was already aware of the situation. His voice was shaking when he asked me what had happened. I told him. The humans had left. He laughed nervously and said they would come back. I asked him if he was certain. He went silent for a long moment. Then he asked me a question that I will remember for the rest of my life. He asked me what we would do if they did not come back. I did not have an answer. I told him I would call him back, and I ended the conversation. I sat alone in my chambers and tried to think clearly. The humans had given us no warning, but had they really given us no warning? I started searching through my old files. I pulled up every diplomatic message from Earth in the last 5 years. There were thousands of them. I had filed most of them away as routine complaints, the kind of emotional outbursts I had come to expect from humans who did not understand how the older species operated. I started reading them. The first message I opened was from 12 years ago. It was a formal complaint about council policies that the human ambassador said were creating a system where younger species could never advance. Language was polite, the arguments were careful, the warnings were clear. I had never read past the first paragraph. I had marked it as low priority and moved on. The second message was from 10 years ago. It warned that humans were building independent supply chains because they no longer trusted the council to treat them fairly. I had laughed at this one when I first received it, I remember. Now, I had shown it to my colleagues and we had joked about how dramatic humans were. The third message was from 8 years ago. It listed 17 specific incidents where council members had treated human delegates with disrespect. It asked in formal language for the council to address these issues. I had filed it without reading the list. The fourth message was from 6 years ago. It was shorter and colder. It said that humans were beginning to question whether membership in the council was worth the constant insults and unfair treatment. The fifth message was from 4 years ago. It said that if certain patterns continued, humans would be forced to consider their options. The sixth message was from 2 years ago. It said that humans were prepared to walk away. The seventh message was from 6 months ago. It said the decision had been made and was waiting only for the right moment. I stopped reading after the seventh message. My hands were shaking too badly to hold the tablet. They had warned us 47 times across 12 years. They had warned us in writing, in person, in formal sessions, in private meetings, and we had ignored every single warning because we believed they needed us more than we needed them. We had been so wrong. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window. The council station spread out below me, vast and beautiful, lit by the soft glow of 1,000 worlds. I could see the human embassy from here. It was dark, the lights were off. There were no human ships at the docking ports. The corner of the station that had always belonged to Earth was empty. For the first time in 40 years, I thought about Helen Carter walking out of the chamber 3 days ago. I thought about her quiet footsteps. I thought about the small smile she had given me as she passed my seat. I had not understood that smile then. I understood it now. It was the smile of someone who knew something I did not. It was the smile of someone who was already gone. The lights in my chamber flickered again. Outside in the hallway I could hear more shouting. Someone was crying. I sat back down at my desk and opened a new document. I needed to write this down, all of it, every detail, because something terrible was about to happen, and someone needed to remember how it had started. It had started with a vote 3 days ago. It had started with a Krell ambassador who laughed. It had started with a Voxian premier who thought himself wise. It had started with me smiling at a quiet human woman as she walked out of her room. It had started with a simple, fatal belief that silence meant weakness. I now know that the humans had been listening. They had been counting. They had been remembering. And while we mocked them and dismissed them and used them, they had been quietly building the door through which they would one day walk away. That door had closed this morning, and as I write these words, I can already feel the cold air rushing in to fill the empty space they left behind. The next 30 days would teach us what that empty space truly meant. The next 30 days would teach us that humans had not just been useful to us, they had been holding our entire civilization together with their patient, quiet work. And without them, everything would fall apart. The morning after the humans left, I woke up to find my apartment dark. Lights would not turn on, the water would not flow from the taps, the food preservation unit had gone warm overnight, and everything inside had gone bad. I stood in my kitchen in the dim light of dawn and realized that the human-built systems that ran my home had stopped working without their daily maintenance signals. I dressed quickly and went to the council station. The transport tubes were running but slowly. Half the lights in the corridors were out. I passed 3 other delegates in the hallway, and all of them looked tired and frightened. The Sithari ambassador, normally proud and elegant, was wearing the same clothes from the day before. Her hair was uncombed. She nodded at me without speaking. The emergency council session began at the 7th hour. I had never seen the chamber so full. Every delegate from every species was present. The seats reserved for human representatives sat empty in the front row, a constant reminder of what we had lost. The speaker tried to bring the meeting to order, but no one was listening. Delegates were shouting at each other. The Krell ambassador was demanding military action. The Tellurian delegate was weeping openly. Finally, the speaker pounded his ceremonial staff against the platform until the chamber went silent. He began by listing what we knew. Every human had left council space within the last 48 hours. Every human-owned business had closed or been transferred to other ownership. Every human-built system that required ongoing human technical support was failing. The council's own translation network, which had been maintained by a human company for 30 years, was breaking down. 3 minor languages had already become untranslatable. The Krell ambassador stood up before the speaker had finished. He demanded that the council send warships to Earth immediately. He said humans had committed an act of economic warfare. He said we must teach them a lesson. They would never forget. I watched him speak and felt something I had never felt before: embarrassment. Deep, burning embarrassment. He was demanding war against a species that had not fired a single shot. They had simply gone home, and he was suggesting we attack them for it. The speaker asked the Krell ambassador if he had reviewed the military assessments. The ambassador said he had not. The speaker pulled up the report on the main screen. The numbers were brutal. 68% of our combined fleet used human-designed targeting systems. Those systems had stopped receiving updates this morning, which meant they would slowly become inaccurate over the coming weeks. 43% of our warships used human-manufactured power couplings. Replacement parts no longer existed because the factories had closed. Every single one of our advanced medical ships had human-trained doctors who were now on transport ships heading home. The Krell ambassador sat down without saying another word. The Sathari Grand Researcher stood up. Next, her voice was thin and broken. She spoke about the medical situation. Cancer treatments she had been receiving for 3 years were manufactured on a human world. She had a 6-month supply remaining. After that, she would die. She was not the only one. Hundreds of thousands of citizens across the council depended on human medicines. Without resupply, many of them would not survive the year. The chamber fell into terrible silence. As she sat down, I rose from my seat. I walked slowly to the speaking platform. My legs felt heavy. I had spent my entire career arguing that humans were a useful but minor species. Now I had to stand before the council and admit how wrong I had been. I began by reading the 7 warning messages I had found in my files. I read them slowly, each word echoing in the quiet chamber. I watched the faces of the delegates change as they listened. I saw recognition. I saw shame. I saw fear. When I finished reading, I told them I had found 47 similar warnings in my own files. I told them I had ignored every one of them. I asked the speaker how many warnings the council itself had received. He looked at his aide. The aide checked the records. The number came back: 231 formal warnings over 12 years. Each one had been logged, filed, and ignored. A delegate from the Brenari Federation stood up. She admitted that her own government had received 43 direct warnings from the human ambassador to her world. She had read each one personally and dismissed each one as an emotional overreaction. She broke down, crying as she spoke. One by one, delegates rose to confess. The Krell admitted to 160 warnings. The Sathari admitted to 200. The smaller species admitted to dozens each. By the time everyone had spoken, the speaker's aide had counted over 4,000 formal warnings sent by humans to council members across the last 15 years. 4,000 warnings, 4,000 chances to change course, 4,000 opportunities to treat humans as equals instead of as servants. We had wasted every single one. The speaker called a recess. I went to the observation deck and stood by the great window that looked out over the station. I could see the empty docks where human ships used to gather. I could see the dark embassy. I could see the closed shops and quiet corridors. A small voice spoke beside me. I turned to find the Tellurian delegate, a young woman named Fessa, standing nearby. Tellurians were a small species often Dismissed by larger ones, she looked up at me with her wide gold eyes and asked if I knew why the humans had really left. I said I thought I did. The trade vote, the insults, the unfair treatment. She shook her head slowly. She told me that a human friend had explained it to her last year. The trade vote was just the final straw. The humans had been ready to leave for a long time. They had been preparing for years. The thing that finally pushed them over the edge was not anger. It was not pride. It was sorrow. I asked her what she meant. Fessa explained that humans had spent 40 years in the council hoping to change it from within. They had hoped that older species would eventually learn to treat younger ones as equals. They had hoped that the system would grow more just over time. But they had watched, year after year, as the same patterns repeated, the same insults, the same unfair votes, the same dismissive attitudes, the same casual cruelty. They had finally realized that the system would never change because the older species did not want it to change. The council was working exactly as it was designed to work. It was a tool for keeping power in the hands of the species that already had power, and no amount of patient reform would ever fix that. So the humans had stopped trying to change us. Instead, they had spent the last 12 years quietly building a future without us. They had developed independent supply chains. They had established their own diplomatic networks with younger species we had ignored. They had created technology we did not understand and could not replicate, and when they were ready, they had simply walked away. Fess's words struck me harder than any insult ever could. She told me one more thing before she walked away. She said the humans had not left to harm us. They had left because they had finally accepted that we could not be saved. The cruelty was too deep. The arrogance was too thick. They had given up on us, not in anger, but in tired sadness. I stood at the window for a long time. After she left, I thought about my career. I thought about every meeting I had attended where humans had spoken and I had not listened. I thought about every report I had filed dismissing their concerns. I thought about every joke I had made at their expense. I had been part of this. I had helped build the system that had finally driven them away, and now I was watching the consequences of my work fall down around me. When the council session resumed, the chaos had returned. The Krell ambassador was demanding new measures. The Safari were demanding action. Several delegates were proposing that we simply seize human assets within council space and use them to keep our systems running. I stood up again. This time my voice was steadier. I told them their proposals were not just wrong, they were impossible. There were no human assets to seize. The humans had transferred everything to other parties before they left. The factories were owned by Tellurian companies. The shipping lanes had been sold to Brennari corporations. The medical research was owned by smaller species that had quietly purchased it for low prices over the last 2 years. Humans had spent years carefully untangling themselves from our economy, leaving nothing behind for us to take. They had not just left, they had made sure we could not punish them for leaving. The Krell ambassador asked me what I proposed instead. I took a deep breath. I proposed that we send an envoy to Earth, not to demand, not to threaten, to apologize, to beg if necessary, to Find out what we needed to do to repair what we had broken. The chamber exploded in protest. The older species accused me of betraying my own people. The Krell ambassador called me a coward. My own Voxian premier sent me a private message telling me to stand down immediately. I refused. I told the council that pride had led us to this disaster. More pride would only make it worse. We had two choices. We could continue to pretend we were strong and watch our civilization slowly collapse over the next year, or we could admit our mistakes and try to rebuild what we had destroyed. The vote was close, very close. 27 species voted in favor of sending an envoy. 26 voted against. The motion passed by a single vote. I was named the lead envoy. That night I went back to my chambers and tried to pack. My apartment was still dark, the water was still off. I packed by the light of an emergency lamp. As I worked, I thought about what I would say to the humans when I reached Earth. I had no idea. Every speech I drafted in my head sounded hollow. Every apology felt insufficient. How do you apologize to a civilization for 40 years of casual cruelty? I did not know, but I had to try. The transport ship that would carry us to Earth was a hastily assembled vessel made up of components from 12 different species. Half of it had once contained human-built parts that had now been removed and replaced with inferior alternatives. The ship rattled when it moved. The communications were unreliable. The navigation system was barely functional. We departed 3 days later, carrying 12 envoys representing the major species of the council. We carried no weapons. We carried no demands. We carried only a desperate hope that the humans would still talk to us. The journey to Earth would take 11 days. 11 days to think about what we had done and what we would say. 11 days to wonder if we would even be allowed to land when we arrived. I spent those 11 days writing in my journal. I wrote about my career. I wrote about my mistakes. I wrote about Helen Carter walking out of the council chamber with her quiet smile. I wrote about Fess standing beside me at the window. I wrote about the 4,000 warnings we had ignored. By the time we entered human space, I had filled 3 notebooks. None of the words felt right. None of them captured what I needed to say. But the time for writing was over. The borders of human space were marked by simple buoys broadcasting a polite message in every council language. The message said that we had entered sovereign Terran space without an invitation. It said we should turn back. We did not turn back. We continued forward slowly with all our weapons powered down in a continuous broadcast announcing our peaceful intent. We were not stopped. We were not contacted. We were simply ignored. For 6 days we drifted through human space. We saw thriving worlds, busy shipyards and structures we did not recognize. The humans had been busy in their absence. They had been building things, new things, things we had no name for. Whatever future they were creating, it was a future they were creating without us. And as our small ship drifted past their vast achievements, I began to understand just how badly we had underestimated them. The council had panicked when humans severed diplomacy. But standing on that ship, looking out at what they had built, I realized something far more frightening. The humans had not panicked at all. They had moved on. On the 7th day of our journey through human space, we reached Sol, Earth itself glowed before us, a blue and white pearl turning slowly against the black. I stood on the bridge of our ship and stared at it through the viewing window. I had seen Earth in pictures and reports 1,000 times, but seeing it with my own eyes for the first time felt different. It looked alive in a way that no other world I had visited ever had. It looked like a place where things grew and changed and refused to stop moving. Around the planet I could see the orbital structures the humans had built. They were enormous. Some of them were larger than Council Station. There were rings of light circling the equator. There were vessels coming and going in patterns I did not understand. There was an entire fleet of ships of a design I had never seen before, sleek and silent. That did not match any human technology. In our records, the humans had built all of this in plain sight, and we had never noticed. We had been too busy looking down on them to look up at what they were doing. Our ship hailed Earth Control. There was no answer for 2 hours. We waited in silence. The other envoys gathered on the bridge. The Krell representative paced back and forth. The Sithari ambassador prayed quietly. The corner, my own aide stood beside me, watching the planet with wide, fearful eyes. Finally, a small shuttle detached from one of the orbital stations and began to approach us. It was unarmed, but it moved with a precision that suggested its pilot was very skilled. The shuttle docked with our ship in perfect silence. Not a single bump, not a single jolt. The airlock opened. A woman stepped through. She was tall, and her hair was gray at the edges. She wore a simple dark suit with no insignia or decoration. She carried a small tablet and nothing else. I recognized her immediately, even though I had never seen her before. She was a senior human diplomat. Her name was Margaret Holloway, and she had worked for the Sol Coordination Authority for 20 years. She did not greet us. She did not smile. She walked to the center of the bridge and stopped. Her eyes moved slowly over our group, studying each of us in turn. When her gaze reached me, she paused. I felt something cold move through me. I realized she knew exactly who I was. She had probably known I would be the one leading this mission. She had probably known for months. She spoke in a steady voice. She asked us why we had come. I stepped forward. I had practiced my speech for 11 days, but in that moment, every prepared word fell out of my head. I spoke from somewhere deeper. I told her we had come to apologize. I told her we had been wrong, deeply wrong, and we wanted to find a way to repair what we had broken. She listened without expression. When I finished, she did not respond for a long moment. The bridge was completely silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade. Then she asked me a question. She asked me what specifically we were apologizing for. I started to answer with general words. The trade vote, the insults, the unfair treatment. She held up her hand to stop me. She said general apologies were the language of people who did not really mean them. She wanted specific apologies for specific actions. She wanted me to look her in the eye and name each thing we had done. So I did. I named the trade vote. I named the Krell ambassador's speech mocking human emotions. I named the Sithari refusal to share medical research during the colony plague. I named my own approval of the order to redirect refugee ships. I named 20 other incidents from my own career. The Krell envoy named his actions next. his voice trembling. The Sathari ambassador named hers, one by one. Every envoy in the room confessed what they had done. It took 3 hours. By the end, several of us were weeping. Margaret Holloway had not moved from her position. She had not interrupted. She had simply listened to every word. When we were finished, she nodded. Slowly, she told us this was a beginning, not a solution, but a beginning. She said the first step toward repair was honest acknowledgement of harm, and we had taken that step. She then explained the situation we were in. She told us that humans had not left the council out of anger, though anger had been part of it. They had left out of necessity. The council, as it was structured, would never have treated younger species as equals. The system was designed to keep older species in power, and no amount of internal reform would change that. Humans had spent decades trying to change it from inside. They had finally accepted that change was impossible. So they had built a different system. She brought up an image on her tablet. It showed a network of small worlds spread across what we call the outer veil. 43 young species, all of whom had been ignored or mistreated by the council, had been quietly working with humans for the last 15 years. They had formed their own trade agreements. They had developed their own technologies. They had created their own diplomatic frameworks based on principles of equal voice and shared decision-making. This new network did not have a name. Yet it did not have a single capital. It did not have a single ruling body. It worked through a system of overlapping councils where every species had equal weight and every decision required broad agreement. It was slower than the old council. It was less efficient, but it worked. And more importantly, it was already larger than the council. We just had not noticed because all of its members had been species we had dismissed. Margaret Holloway said something then that struck me harder than anything I had heard before. She said that for 15 years humans had not been trying to compete with the council. They had been replacing it, not with force, not with threats, with patience and quiet construction. They had simply built something better while we were not paying attention. The Krell envoy asked her what we should do now. She looked at him for a long moment. Before answering, she said the humans had no interest in destroying the council. The council could continue to exist if we wanted it to, but humans would not be returning. Their place was now in the new network they had helped create. What humans would offer us, she said, was a choice. We could continue to operate the council as we had always operated it. We could maintain our diplomatic protocols, our trade systems, our hierarchies. Humans would not interfere. We could rule our own space according to our own rules. We could cling to our pride and our power for as long as we were able. Or we could begin the long, painful process of dismantling the council's old structures and building something new, something based on the principles we had observed in the human network: equal voice, shared decision-making, respect for all species, regardless of age or size. If we chose this second path, humans would consider eventually opening limited diplomatic and trade relations with the new system we built. Not a return to membership, not a partnership, just the beginning of conversation. The Sithari ambassador asked how long this would take. Margaret Holloway smiled. For the first time since arriving on our ship, it was Not a warm smile, it was the small, sad smile of someone who had seen something difficult before. She said it would take a generation, maybe two. Trust takes much longer to build than to destroy. Humans would not rush this process, and they would not accept rushed solutions. She told us that our envoy mission had been our last chance to speak directly with human leadership for at least the next 10 years. After today, all formal communication between humans and the Council would go through neutral intermediaries from the Tellurian Federation. We would have no embassies. We would have no direct contact. We would have to earn the right to speak with humans again, slowly, by demonstrating that we had truly changed. The Krell envoy started to protest. He said this was unreasonable. He said the Council had been the dominant power in the galaxy for 10,000 years. He said we deserved more respect than this. Margaret Holloway turned to him. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. She said that for 10,000 years the Council had ruled by treating younger species as inferior. For 10,000 years it had used its power to extract, to dominate, and to dismiss. For 10,000 years civilizations had risen and fallen at the edges of its control while older species grew rich on their suffering. She said humans had been patient students of history. They had read every record, every treaty, every report. They knew what the Council had done to the Brenari before the Brenari joined. They knew what had been done to the Tellurians. They knew what had been done to the Safari themselves before the Safari were powerful enough to resist. She said the Council had not earned the respect it was demanding. It had earned the response it was now receiving. The Krell envoy sat down heavily. He did not speak again for the rest of the meeting. Margaret Holloway turned back to the rest of us. She said she had one more thing to share with us. She said it was important that we understood it. She told us that humanity was not unique. There was nothing special about humans that had allowed them to do what they did. They were not stronger than other species. They were not smarter. They were not braver. The only thing that made them different was that they had remembered when they joined the Council what it felt like to be small and dismissed, and they had refused to forget that feeling even as they grew in power and influence. Most species, she said, forget. They join the Council as small voices and grow into large ones. Once they are large, they begin to treat new small voices the way they themselves were once treated. The cycle continues. It had continued for 10,000 years. Humans had broken the cycle not by being better than anyone else, just by remembering longer. She said this was the simplest gift she could give us, the knowledge that what humans had done was not impossible for us to do as well. We could remember, we could choose differently, we could break our own cycle, but we would have to do it ourselves. Humans would not save us. They would not lead us. They would not even watch us. They had their own civilization to build. We would have to find our own path. She turned to leave. I called after her. I asked her if there was any single thing we could do right now in this moment that would prove our intentions. She stopped. She turned back. She looked at me with eyes that contained no anger, only deep tiredness. She said yes, there was one thing. She said we should listen to our own small voices, the species we had ignored, the delegates we had dismissed, the Tellurians, the Brenari, the lesser members. She said they had been telling us the truth for centuries, and we had not been hearing them. If we wanted to change, we should start by listening to them, not as a strategy, not as a tactic, as an honest practice of attention. She said this would be the test. If we could hear them, we could hear ourselves. If we could not, we would never change, and humans would have no reason to ever speak with us again. Then she walked back to her shuttle. Airlock closed behind her. The shuttle detached and returned to its orbital station. We were left alone on our small ship, drifting in human space, surrounded by structures we did not understand. We sat in silence for a long time. The Krell envoy stared at the floor. The Sithari ambassador wept quietly. I looked out at Earth and tried to memorize the shape of it, because I knew I would never see it again. Eventually, our captain announced that we should begin the journey home. There was nothing more for us to do here. As we turned the ship and began the long flight back to Council space, I thought about Margaret Holloway's final words. I thought about the small voices we had ignored. I thought about Fessa, the Tellurian delegate, standing beside me at the window of the Council station, telling me things I had not been ready to hear. I had a long flight ahead of me, 11 days. Back to the Council, 11 days to think about what I would say when I arrived. 11 days to decide what kind of envoy I would be, and what kind of Vaxian, and what kind of person. And 11 days to begin learning for the first time in my life how to actually listen. The journey home was very different from the journey out. On the way to Earth, we had been frightened but united by a single purpose. We were going to apologize and seek forgiveness. On the way back, we were carrying something much heavier. We were carrying the truth that there would be no quick forgiveness, no return to how things had been, no simple solution to the problem we had created. I spent the first 3 days of the journey in my small cabin writing. I wrote down everything Margaret Holloway had said, word for word, as best I could remember. I wrote down every small voice I had ignored over my career. I made a list of names, Tellurian delegates I had dismissed, Brenari ambassadors I had interrupted, younger species whose concerns I had filed away without reading. The list grew very long. By the end of the 3rd day, it filled 12 pages. On the 4th day, I went to find Fessa. The Tellurian delegate had been one of the envoys, though she had said almost nothing during our meeting with Margaret Holloway. I found her in the small ship library reading a book in her own language. She looked up when I entered. Her gold eyes were calm. I sat down across from her. I told her wanted to listen. I told her I had spent 20 years dismissing her people, and I wanted to start hearing them now, even if it was too late to change what had already happened. I asked her if she would talk to me about her species, about her concerns, about the things I had failed to understand. She studied me for a long moment. Then she set down her book and began to speak. She told me about the Tellurian home world. It was a small planet, colder than most Council worlds, with a thin atmosphere and difficult agriculture. Her people had developed slowly, building careful, patient civilizations that valued cooperation over competition. They had been admitted to the Council 200 years ago and had spent every year since being treated as a minor curiosity. She told me about the Council vote 30 years ago that had reduced Tellurian voting weight to 1/3 the value of larger species. She told me about the trade rules that had crushed their fragile economy. She told me about the educational programs that had been promised to her world and never delivered. She told me about the medical assistance her people had requested 70 times and been denied. She told me about her own daughter who had wanted to become a council diplomat and had been refused entry to the Voxian Diplomatic Academy 3 times, despite scoring at the top of every entrance examination. The academy had given different reasons, each time all of them polite, all of them clearly false. I listened, I did not interrupt, I did not defend my people, I did not explain. I simply listened the way Margaret Holloway had listened to our confessions on Earth. When she finished, I asked her if she would tell me more. She asked me if I really wanted to hear it. I said yes. She talked for 6 more hours. She told me about her grandfather who had served as a Tellurian ambassador to the council and had died of a treatable illness because council medical staff had prioritized other patients ahead of him. She told me about her first marriage, which had ended because her husband, a researcher, had been denied access to council scientific facilities for 20 years and had finally given up on his career and turned bitter. She told me about her hometown, which had lost half its young people to migration because there were no opportunities under the current council system. I wrote down everything she said. By the end of our conversation, I had filled another notebook. My hand ached from writing, my eyes burned, but something inside me felt different. I felt like I had been carrying a heavy stone for many years and had only now realized it was there. That night I could not sleep. I went to the bridge and stood by the viewing window watching the stars stream by as we traveled at faster than light speed. The Krell envoy was already there. He looked tired and old. He had been the loudest voice on the way to Earth, demanding action and respect. Now he looked smaller somehow. He did not speak for a long time. Then he asked me what I planned to do when we got back to the council. I told him I planned to do what Margaret Holloway had suggested. I planned to listen. I planned to spend the next year visiting every small species that had been ignored by the council, hearing what they had to say and reporting their concerns to my own government. He asked me if I thought my government would listen. I told him I did not know, but I had to try. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something I had not expected. He told me that the Krell government had received an internal report 2 years ago. The report had warned that the Empire was becoming dangerously dependent on human technology and human services. The report had recommended a careful, gradual reduction in this dependence. The Krell leadership had read the report and laughed at it. They had filed it away. The author of the report had been demoted and sent to a backwater system as punishment for being alarmist. The author of the report, the Krell envoy said, had been his own son. He told me his son had warned him personally 3 years ago. He had told him to take the human concern seriously, to push for reform, to listen to what they humans were saying. The envoy had refused. He had told his son he did not understand politics. He had told his son that humans were emotional and would always remain dependent on council infrastructure. He had told his son to stop making trouble. His son had stopped making trouble, and now 3 years later his son was right. And he was wrong, and his own civilization was crumbling around him. He asked me what he should do. I did not know what to tell him. After a long silence, I said maybe he should start by calling his son. He nodded slowly. He pulled out his communicator and walked to the other side of the bridge to make the call. I heard his voice trembling as he spoke. I did not listen to the words. They were not for me to hear. On the 7th day of the journey, the captain announced that we were approaching council space, the mood on the ship was somber but focused. Each of us had spent the journey thinking about what we would do when we arrived. None of us had simple answers, but each of us had begun the slow work of changing how we thought. The Sithari ambassador had spent her time speaking with the Brenari envoy, hearing concerns her species had ignored. For centuries, the Voxian Jr. delegate had been writing letters to colleagues back home, preparing them for difficult conversations. Even the Krell envoy had begun in his quiet way to study the records of past council decisions, looking for patterns of harm he had not previously seen. We arrived at Council Station on the morning of the 11th day. We disembarked into a station that was visibly struggling. More lights were out, more systems had failed. The corridors were cold because the climate controls had begun to break down. People walked through the hallways looking exhausted and frightened. The speaker greeted us at the main docking port. He looked thinner than when we had left. His eyes were red. He asked me to give the report to the full council immediately. I agreed. The chamber was packed. Every delegate from every species was present. The galleries above were filled with citizens and journalists from across the galaxy. This report would be broadcast to every member world of the council. I walked to the speaking platform. I had no notes. I had decided not to use any. I would speak from what I had learned in my own words, without polish or preparation. I began by describing what we had seen on the journey to Earth. I described the orbital structures, the new ships, the bustling activity of human civilization. I told them honestly that humans were thriving without us. I told them they had built things we did not understand and would not be able to replicate. I described our meeting with Margaret Holloway. I read out as accurately as I could the things she had said to us. I explained the choice she had offered. We could continue the council as it was, or we could begin the long work of dismantling its old structures and building something new. Humans would not return. There would be no negotiation about that. They had moved on. Question was whether we would move on as well in our own way towards something better. I described what we had agreed to do. Each envoy would return to their own government and present a single recommendation. We would recommend that the council begin a complete restructuring of its diplomatic protocols, its trade systems, and its voting procedures. We would recommend equal voting weight for all member species. We would recommend that all council decisions require broad agreement rather than simple majority votes that allowed older species to dominate. We would recommend that resources currently flowing toward older species be redistributed to support the development of younger and smaller members. I knew as I spoke that these recommendations would not be popular. Many delegates were already shifting in their seats. The Krell envoy beside me, who had agreed to support the recommendations during our journey, looked tense and uncertain. I worried he might back out at the last moment. When I finished my report, I asked him to speak. To my surprise, he stood up and walked to the platform with steady steps. He confirmed everything I had said. He added that his own government, after he had spoken with them by long-distance message during our journey, had agreed to support the recommendations. The Krell ambassador in the chamber, who had been the loudest voice for military action when we left, looked stunned. His government had overruled him without even consulting him first. The Sithari ambassador spoke next. She also confirmed our report. She announced that the Sithari government had voted in an emergency session held yesterday to support full restructuring of the council. She named specific reforms her people would champion. She apologized publicly for her own past behavior, in particular the refusal to share medical research during the colony plague. One by one, every envoy on our mission stood and confirmed the report. Each of them announced that their government had agreed to support reform. The chamber grew quieter and quieter as the announcements continued. When the last envoy sat down, the speaker rose. He addressed the chamber directly. He said the council faced a choice. We could begin the work of reform immediately, or we could continue to fight against change and watch our civilization slowly collapse over the coming years. He called for a vote. The vote took 2 hours. Every delegate from every species cast their ballot. The results came in slowly, displayed on the great screen above the chamber. The reforms passed, not by a single vote, like our envoy mission had passed, but by a clear majority. 41 species voted yes, 12 voted no. The older species had not all changed their minds, but enough had, and the younger species had voted unanimously in favor. The council, as we had known it, ended. That day, the structures we had built over 10,000 years were dismantled. New structures, modeled in part on what we had observed in the human network, were beginning to be built in their place. It would take years to complete the transition, decades perhaps. It would be painful, it would be slow, it would be imperfect, but it had begun. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the light still flickering and the heating still unreliable. I opened my journal and began to write the final chapter of my report on the envoy mission. I would submit it to the new council the next morning. As I wrote, I thought about Margaret Holloway. I thought about her tired eyes and her careful words. I thought about the simple truth she had given us. We could remember, we could choose differently, we could break our own cycle. We had chosen at last to begin. The human civilization on Earth would never know, or perhaps never care about what was happening here. They had moved on to their own future. They were building things we could not yet imagine. But they had left us with one final gift. They had left us with the knowledge that change was possible, even for civilizations as old and proud as ours. We just had to want it badly enough to do the hard work. For the first time in 20 years, I felt something I had not expected to feel. I felt hope. 2 years passed. The reforms moved slowly, but they moved. The council, now called something different in every language because no single new name had been agreed upon, became a body of equal voices. The voting weight system was abolished entirely. Every species, large or small, ancient or recent, had the same vote. Decisions required broad agreement, not narrow majorities. Trade rules were rewritten to favor development of weaker economies rather than the protection of stronger ones. It was difficult. The older species resisted at every step. Many of my Vaxian colleagues fought the changes openly. There were resignations, public arguments, and bitter divisions. The Krell Empire split into two factions, one supporting reform and one opposing it. The reformers won, but only after years of internal struggle. The Sathari faced a similar crisis. Several smaller species nearly left the new system out of frustration with how slowly things were moving. But things did move. I traveled constantly during those 2 years. I visited 43 worlds across what we had once called the periphery. I sat in small meeting halls and listened to local leaders explain their concerns. I took notes. I asked questions. I tried very hard not to give advice unless it was asked for. I tried very hard to do what Margaret Holloway had suggested. I tried to listen. It was harder than I had expected. My instincts, built up over 20 years of treating myself as a senior diplomat, kept pushing me to interrupt, to explain, to lead. I had to consciously stop myself many times each day. Some days I did better than others. There were times when I caught myself mid-sentence, talking over a small voice, and had to apologize and ask the person to start again. The Tellurian delegate Fessa became my closest friend during this period. We spoke almost every week, sometimes in person, sometimes over long distance communication. She told me which species I should visit next, which leaders I should meet, which concerns were most urgent. She was patient with me when I made mistakes. She corrected me gently when I fell back into old habits. She introduced me to people I would never have met on my own. Through her, I met a Brenari historian named Tana, who had spent her life documenting council injustices. I met a young leader of the Huani people, a species I had never heard of, whose population had been reduced to 7,000 by council policies during the last century. I met an elderly Cordian poet who had written about her people's suffering for 60 years. Her work translated into only one council language and read by almost no one outside her own world. Each conversation taught me something new, each one filled in a piece of a picture I had refused to see for most of my life. On the second anniversary of the human withdrawal, I received a message. It was sent through the Tellurian neutral diplomatic service, the only channel that now connected us with humans. The message was short. It contained an invitation. A small human delegation would be willing to attend a meeting on Tellurian neutral territory in 3 months. The meeting would not be a return to formal diplomatic relations. It would be only a single conversation, a measure of how things had progressed. I was named by unanimous vote of the new council as the lead representative for our side. I prepared for the meeting for 3 months. I read every report on the reforms we had made. I gathered testimony from species across the galaxy about how their lives had changed. I assembled delegation that included representatives from 12 species, 6 of whom had been considered minor or insignificant by the old council. Fessa was on the delegation, so was Tana the Brenari historian, so was the young Wani leader We traveled to the Tellurian neutral world together. The meeting was held in a simple meeting hall on a quiet hillside surrounded by gardens. It was not grand, it was not formal, it was deliberately humble. The human delegation arrived on a small shuttle. Margaret Holloway stepped off just as she had appeared on our envoy ship 2 years earlier. She was older now, her hair fully gray, but she walked with the same calm steadiness. She was accompanied by 2 younger humans, a man named Daniel Brooks and a woman named Caroline Webb. Margaret Holloway greeted me first. She did not smile, but her eyes were kinder than they had been on our previous meeting. She said it was good to see me again. I told her it was an honor to be received. We sat down together in the simple meeting hall. There were no speeches. There were no opening statements. Margaret Holloway simply asked us to tell her what had changed. I had prepared a long presentation. I set it aside. Instead, I asked Fessa to speak first. Fessa described the Tellurian experience. She spoke about how the new voting system had allowed her people to finally participate as equals. She talked about the new trade rules that had ended the economic harm her world had suffered for 200 years. She described the educational programs that were finally being delivered, the medical assistance that was finally arriving, the diplomatic respect that was finally being shown to her people. She talked for an hour. Margaret Holloway listened without interrupting. Tona spoke next. She described the historical record being rewritten with input from species who had been ignored. She talked about the new academic institutions being founded on younger worlds, the libraries being built, the histories being preserved. She talked about the apologies that had been issued by older species to specific younger ones for specific acts of harm. She named some of the apologies she found most meaningful. The young Wani leader spoke after that. He spoke about the rebuilding of his people's population, the return of citizens who had fled to other worlds, the gradual recovery of their culture and language and confidence. He thanked the new council for finally providing the support his people had needed for 100 years. Each member of our delegation spoke in turn. Each one described real changes in real lives, not promises, not plans, actual results. When the last speaker finished, Margaret Holloway asked me if I had anything to add. I shook my head. I told her our delegation had said everything that needed to be said. The work was not finished. It would never be truly finished, but it was real and it was continuing, and we were committed to it. Margaret Holloway turned to her 2 human companions. They spoke quietly together for several minutes. Then she turned back to us. She said the human delegation accepted our report as a sign of meaningful progress. She said this was not a return to full diplomatic relations. That would still take many more years and require continued evidence of sustained change. But she said the channels of communication could now begin to open more widely. Limited trade agreements could be discussed. Cultural exchanges could be considered. Researchers from our worlds could begin applying to study at human institutions, though acceptance would be on a case-by-case basis. She said most importantly that humans now believed that what we had begun was real. She was quiet for a moment, then she said something I had not expected. She said that humans had been watching us closely for 2 years. They had been studying our reforms, our debates, our setbacks, our progress. They had seen the resignations, they had seen the resistance, they had seen the slow, painful work of changing minds and changing systems. She said they had been impressed. She said they had not expected us to do as well as we had done. They had expected the old structures to reassert themselves. They had expected reform to fail or to become merely cosmetic. They had been preparing for a much darker outcome. But we had surprised them. We had done the work. We had not done it perfectly, but we had done it honestly, and we had done it together. She told me, looking directly at me, that the choice to listen had made the difference. The choice to truly hear small voices had been the foundation of everything else we had built. She said this was the simplest and most difficult thing any civilization could do. She thanked us for doing it. I felt tears fill my eyes. I had not expected gratitude. I had not expected praise. I had only expected the chance to begin a conversation, to be told that we had done well, that we had impressed the humans, that we had given them reason for hope, was more than I had imagined possible. I told her as steadily as I could that we had done it for ourselves. We had done it because it was the right thing to do, but I also told her that her words 2 years ago had been the seed. Without that meeting, without her honesty, without the choice she had offered us, we would not have known where to begin. She nodded. She said the credit belonged to us. The choice had been ours. The work had been ours. The change was ours. But she was glad to have helped in her small way by simply telling us the truth. The meeting ended after another hour of less formal conversation. We exchanged gifts, simple ones, books and small artworks from our worlds. We made plans to meet again in another 2 years. Human delegation returned to their shuttle and departed. As their ship disappeared into the sky, I stood with Fess on the hillside, watching it go. She asked me how I felt. I thought about it for a long moment. I felt many things. I felt relief. I felt pride. I felt more than anything the strange peace that comes when a long burden begins to lift. I told her I felt grateful. She nodded. She said gratitude was a good place to begin the next chapter. We walked back down the hillside together. The garden around the meeting hall was full of flowers in bloom. The wind was soft and warm. The sky above us was clear and blue. I have written this account because I want others to remember what happened. I want them to remember the panic in the council chambers when the humans severed all diplomacy. I want them to remember the fear, the chaos, the slow understanding of how much we had taken for granted. I want them to remember the 4,000 warnings we ignored before the door finally closed. But I also want them to remember what came after. I want them to remember that we chose to change, we chose to listen, we chose at last to do the difficult work of becoming a better civilization than the one we had been. The humans had not saved us. They had simply walked away and forced us to save ourselves. In the end, that was the greatest gift they could have given us. And we, despite all our pride and all our errors, had finally been wise enough to accept it. The galaxy is different now, smaller in some ways. The vast unified council I once served is gone forever, but the fragments that remain and the new structures we have built among ourselves are healthier than what came before. Voices that were never heard are now being listened to. Species that were forgotten are now being seen. The work continues every day, in every meeting, in every small choice to truly hear what someone is saying. I am older now. My career is mostly behind me, but I still travel when I can. I still listen when invited. I still write down what I learn. And every 2 years, when our delegation meets with the humans on the Tellurian neutral world, I bring new stories to share, new voices that have been heard, new harms that have been repaired, new small steps toward a better way of being. Margaret Holloway has retired now, but other humans come in her place. They listen as she did. They ask careful questions. They take notes. They return home to their own civilization, which continues to grow in ways we still do not fully understand. We do not need to understand them anymore. We are too busy understanding ourselves. That is enough. That is in fact more than I once believed was possible. The day the humans severed all diplomacy was the worst day of my life. It was also, though I could not have known it at the time, the day my life truly began. I am grateful for it. I will be grateful for it until the day I die.